far you have come on your own, but never alone. Through the rain and through the shine, here's your moment, it's your time. You stood tall and now you see, standing in your destiny. 100 women growing strong. 100 women where you belong. You stood tall and now you see, you have reached your destiny. Woman, woman.
As people of African descent, we offer this land recognition in solidarity with the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island in the efforts and deliberate intentions toward decolonization. As people of African descent, we acknowledge the land of Turtle Island that sustains us, express deep gratitude to its indigenous peoples, and pledge to honor our dignity and divinity that ultimately connects us all. By Kay Johnson. Welcome to 100 ABC Fireside Chats. 100 Accomplished Black Canadian Women is a bold project initiated by co-authors and co-founders, the Honorable Dr. Jean Augustine, Dr. Denise O'Neill Green, and Donna Jones Simmons. Our mission is to celebrate and archive the professional accomplishments of trailblazing Black women from all across Canada. The goal is to create an ever-expanding database available for current and future generations via print media, public and private libraries, as well as our website, which is www.100abcwomen.ca. In addition to our fireside chats on topics that matter to our communities, such as education, healthcare, entertainment, creative arts, trade union, and so much more, we offer biennial book launching galas and biannual symposiums. The co-authors and co-founders would like to take this opportunity to thank each of you for attending today's fireside chat. We know that you will find these sessions educational and inspirational. So sit back, relax, and hear from our brilliant and talented honorees.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Wishing everyone a happy Father's Day, a meaningful Indigenous Awareness Month, and a joyful Pride season. Today's June 21st, and it marks the official start of summer. And I know many of us have been eagerly looking towards this season of warmth, connection, and renewal. So settle in, get comfortable, pour yourself your favorite drink. And if you haven't already, send a quick reminder to a friend or family member to log on and join us. Before we begin this most important conversation, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and sincerely thank Donna Jones Simmons for her vision, tenacity, and unwavering commitment to creating and sustaining the fireside chats on a Sunday evening. These conversations are unique to Canada and continue to educate, challenge, and empower our communities. Donna, we're really grateful for your leadership, and I would also like to thank Takia for helping to ensure everything runs smoothly with the technology. This afternoon's conversation is both timely and necessary. We'll be exploring criminal justice in Canada, systemic reform, restorative practices, and community-based safety initiatives, all topics that many people assume they will never need to think about until suddenly they do. The good news is that we don't have to wait for a crisis before becoming informed, engaged, and prepared. I encourage everyone to listen openly, reflect deeply, and engage thoughtfully as we all learn from the expertise and living experiences of our panelists. Without much ado, this is what the afternoon will look like. I'll introduce the panelists. There'll be 2 rounds of questions, and I'm really encouraging you to write your questions and comments in the chat. Again, thank you so much for being here, and let's get started. Bear with me as I read the bios of the panelists. Adding her expertise to today's conversation is Dr. Barb Hamilton Hinch, and Barb uses the pronouns she and her. Barb is from the historical African Nova Scotian communities of Beachville and Cherrybrook. She is the daughter of the late Norman Hamilton and Bernice Hamilton McLaughlin. She's the mother of 3 amazing men, Obadiah, David Anthony, and Dylan, and the partner to David Hinch. She's a full professor in the School of Health and Human Performance and the Assistant Vice Provost of Equity and Inclusion at Dalhousie University. Barb's interdisciplinary research explores the impacts of structural, systemic, and institutional racism and discrimination on diverse populations, particularly individuals of Black African, African Canadian, African Nova Scotian, and Caribbean descent. It's good to see you, Barb, and we look forward to your offerings.
Thank you, Nancy.
Bringing additional perspective to this discussion is Patricia Brown. Patricia is a sole practitioner, licensed in both the state of Michigan and the province of Ontario. Her practice areas include criminal defense, mental health, and immigration law, with offices in Windsor and Chatham, Ontario. She's married to her amazing husband, John, and is the mother of her beautiful daughter, Monique. In May, Patricia became a grandmother to her shining star, Theo. Patricia has represented clients in many courts for well over a decade. Among those are the Ontario Court of Justice, Superior Court of Justice, the Court of Appeal for Ontario, Provincial Offence Court, the Supreme Court of Canada, the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, the Consent and Capacity Board, and the Ontario Review Board. As you have heard, our 2 panelists represent a wide range of backgrounds and experiences across the justice system. Let's draw on this wealth of knowledge by exploring a few key issues and hearing their insights and perspectives. So, the first question goes to Barb. Through some of your research with supporting individuals to integrate back into community and with family, what have been some of the challenges you hear?
Thank you for that question, and really looking forward to the conversation this afternoon, and hoping it can be more of a conversation that we have with each other. And so some of the research that I've had, and I've been fortunate to have received funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada over the past 3 years to look really intensely at this subject. And so my topic looks at the reintegration of individuals who've been involved in the criminal justice system, reintegrating back into the community, and not just the individual, but also their family. And it's important to acknowledge the fact that African Canadians represent 9.2% of federal incarceration rates, while only making up 3% of the Canadian population. And this national data mirrors our overrepresentation of Black people in provincial institutions as well. And we know that through research, the largest populations in our prison systems are often Black and Indigenous. And when we think about some of their needs around reintegration, and not just reintegration, but even some of the supports or lack of supports in the justice system while they're incarcerated, many have talked about the lack of representation and culturally relevant programming and resources. And so it would be really great if we had a system that supported people while they were incarcerated and continued some of those services as they were reintegrating back into community. And so they acknowledge the fact, and this is from the voices of the participants who have experience being involved in the justice system, and they would often recognize the fact that there are some programs specific to the Indigenous community in our prisons. And that's not taking away at all from our brothers and sisters who are Indigenous, but just acknowledging the need for culturally relevant programming that also supports our people of African descent. Similarly, while they're incarcerated, there's very few services that support mental health, as well as in the community when they come back into the community. We know that mental health is a topic that is often very challenging for us to talk about in the Black community. There's a level of mistrust with our healthcare system. There's a level of mistrust with our justice system. And so we recognize that there's a need to normalize mental health, but it is even more a need to have mental health clinicians that reflect our community. We definitely need to have more mental health clinicians, particularly Black males, that can, because a large population of our individuals we're referring to are Black men. Although we recognize that the fastest number growing of people being incarcerated is also Black women. There's an increase in our number of Black women that are being incarcerated. And so when they come into the community, we need to find some support, mental health support. We also need to recognize the breakdown in family structure, whatever that may look like. And so when people are coming back in the community, we need to support them within the family. We don't often think about the family that is left in the community and how they're impacted by someone who may be incarcerated, and then how they're impacted when they're coming back into the community. How do we support that community to gel back again, if that is the desire of the family? How do we support someone who may think they're coming back into the family and have to maybe perhaps go into a halfway house, or there's been a breakdown in that family? How do we support that? So we need a number of social supports. So in Nova Scotia, we're very fortunate to have several programs that help support with the reintegration. We have our 902 Man Up that supports individuals in our community. We have our Nova Scotia Brotherhood, Nova Scotia Sisterhood, and some of these organizations run programs specifically to support individuals coming back into the community. We also know that we need to provide assistance, and there might be some individuals who don't have identification. Through our project, there were some folks who didn't know where their ID was, and from a birth certificate onto a social insurance number. So through our social prescribing program, we were able to help this individual get their ID, and they needed their ID in order to open up a bank account. They needed their ID in order to go on social assistance. So a lot of us take some of these things for granted if we haven't had that experience. So having to help from the beginning to the end, there's a number of individuals who have the interest to continue their education. And we have our Nova Scotia Community College that supports individuals coming who've been incarcerated and going into post-secondary education. So we supported some of our individuals with their application fee so they can begin to go into post-secondary. And we really need to try and find better ways to help our community members, because indeed these are our brothers and sisters, our aunts and our uncles, our mothers that are going through this reintegration, and as much as possible to normalize that, to help them to develop a place of safety where they can also land. We need to recognize the over-surveillance that often happens when people are being integrated back into the community, and how can we provide a different type of parole? And that might be involving some of our community organizations to step up in that way. It may involve having an organization support that person while they're on parole and on probation. And another thing that is nationally an issue is affordable housing. We really need to look at our housing shortages. And so that is another challenge for individuals coming into community. They don't always want to go into a shelter, but where do we have where we can locate a safe place for some individuals who are starting back over, and some are restricted where they can go in terms of going back into a community where they once lived or going back into their neighborhood. So how do we support them finding housing? And so we look at our basic needs as humans, housing, employment, education. These are really key components that we found that many of our individuals need, that we are not providing in an adequate way in our communities to help reduce recidivism and to help improve success of people reintegrating back into our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barb. That was a fulsome response. I wonder, Patricia, if you have anything to add or any follow-up question to Barb in regards to her response in this topic.
No, I actually agree with a lot of things Dr. Barb Hamilton Hinch has stated, because as a frontline criminal defense lawyer, a lot of the items that the doctor has brought forward to the table today is exactly what we're actually experiencing in real time, and dealing with an individual who's being trying to reallocate back in society. I wonder, Dr. Hamilton, if you can also talk to us about any particular needs for pre-charge or after your sentence reintegration. So sometimes when we are having an individual be released, some type of planning. Is there, because we see that oftentimes in the mental health components, working with organizations such as the Canadian Mental Health Association, et cetera. But what about us? Is there a resource that we can have or put together to help with discharge planning from being incarcerated?
I'm glad you asked that question. We had one of my students who is a doctor in OT, and they developed what's called a wellness wheel from an Afrocentric perspective. And in our program, in our project, we used the wellness wheel to determine what our clients needed as they were reintegrating back into community or reallocating back into community. And so the wellness wheel, we would look at things such as their physical wellness. And then we would figure out, what do they need? Is it exercise program? Because some have a habitual develop an exercise program that they've developed and they want to continue that when they come out. What about their eating? What kind of eating patterns? What kind of food? Sleep? We also look at anything around preventative medical care and getting a good checkup with a physician. That's where our Nova Scotia Brotherhood comes in. So doing a health screening as well. Dental care. We sometimes don't think about dental care. So we'll look at the physical wellness. We then will look at the intellectual wellness. In terms of schooling, do they want to go back to school? Do they need a psychoeducation assessment? What can we support them in terms of their intellectual wellness? Do they want to learn new things? Another one is the emotional wellness and mental wellness of people. So managing their stress, how can we support that? What resources are out there that could help them manage their stress, get some grow in that area? Healing from internalized racism, both that they experienced before being incarcerated and while incarcerated. Looking at their spiritual wellness and their purpose in life. So when we talk about spiritual wellness, we're not talking about religion, but just helping them to find that purpose in life, their beliefs and values, connections to a higher power, using the Goza Saba principles, teaching them mindfulness. We look at the environmental wellness, financial wellness, occupational wellness. So paid work, volunteer work, self-care, chores, parenting, all those are part of the occupational wellness, and as well as the social wellness in terms of supporting through strong social networks, family, friends, if there's any unresolved conflicts that they need to support. So we use this, which we call our Black Lives Living Well, as a model to help with reintegration. So our community navigators would sit with this wellness wheel as folks are in our project and go through that and see which area they're doing well in, which area do they need support in, and then we begin to navigate some of the resources that we have in our communities to support the areas where they need support. And it has been very, very helpful. And so that wheel is soon to be published by the founder, Lisa Dennis, and look forward to it being used nationally by folks, because it does come from an Afrocentric perspective, which is often missing when we're talking about reintegration.
Thank you for that, Barb. And we have a question here in the chat for either of you. How can Black communities lead innovative solutions to improve justice outcomes and community well-being? So you were talking quite a bit about well-being more on the personal level. You did connect with the community-wide, but the question is wanted to know anything more concrete around how do we also support the community's well-being in response to the trauma, to that person being removed from the community, coming back in. And I believe you touched on that earlier, Barb. If you could just say a bit more.
Yeah, I think that we need to think about the impact even on the family within the community, right? Like sometimes the family goes through such shame, and we don't know the reasons why someone might have been involved in the criminal justice system and why they might have ended up being incarcerated. And that family is in a very vulnerable position. And that's when we need each other the most. So how can we come and gather around the family and support them, particularly if there's children or siblings in that household? Because we know that in our Black communities, and I know in Nova Scotia, because we're small, I'm sure it's the same in other communities, because in our communities, no matter where we are, if someone gets incarcerated, everybody seems to know. And so we know that when a child goes to school and they know that a parent has been incarcerated, their friends now know, and their friends' parents now know. So now all of a sudden, this child who had sleepovers, people come to their home, and it was no problem, is now shunned. Can't have friends. Their parents are afraid. But why are the parents now afraid? Because someone in their household has been incarcerated? That shouldn't impact the family depending on what that crime is, but try to understand what that community is going through. So as a community, we need to have spaces where people can go and talk about this. We don't often have these talking circles because we've been taught to see that as being shameful, as opposed to that's when we're most vulnerable and we need to come together. And so I applaud, like I said, some of the organizations such as the 902 Man Up, the Nova Scotia and Brotherhood, who have talking circles, community mobilization. When there's a victim when something happens in our community, there's an organization called Community Mobilization. And a lot of them are mental health clinicians that will come together and say, okay, something traumatic happened in our community. We're going to have talking circles on these days. If you're interested, please come. You can join this talking circle or we can have some one-on-one. So we're beginning to really take responsibility collectively as a community and as a family. And I think we need to see more of that. In Ngozi Saba, Mbutu, I am because you are. And I often would tell people, we don't know if any of us will be in that situation ever. And even though we all have a high level of education, we're knowledgeable. I remember being an expert witness in the court for one of the reports that I wrote. And I said, if my family was ever threatened, I could need an IRCA, an impact, race, and cultural assessment. I don't know. We don't know what our pushing limit is in terms of protecting our family. And I would hope that ever that happened to me, my community would be there to support my family.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's another question, and I think we have some time that we can ask it at this moment. What role do education, housing, employment, and mental health services play in preventing crime? So again, I think you both touched on that. Patricia, I don't know if you want to jump in on this one.
Sure. I'd love to. I think that education, employment, and mental health have a significant impact on whether an individual falls within the criminal justice system or not. First of all, employment and education offer stability, routine. And if an individual is attending classes or has stable employment, they are busy, they are occupied, and will not otherwise engage in criminal activity. They won't need to seek out ill-begotten gains to participate in some type of criminal activity in order to gain income. So the lack of employment opportunities, the lack of investment in mental health care is also a big factor as well. Sometimes and oftentimes, the first time an individual gets help to a psychiatrist, medication and treatment, they're in bail court. And a psychiatric or forensic assessment must take place or has to take place first. And that's their first confirmed diagnosis of bipolar, schizophrenia, or severe anxiety disorder, or panic disorder, or trauma. And so oftentimes, a young individual with no prior criminal record or criminal antecedents, where the parents and family members are frustrated. I've seen this in my province, specifically in Ontario, where a young person who might have a first episode of psychosis might find themselves in a situation where they lash out because they're hearing voices or they're unwell. And instead of getting access to a psychiatrist, their first encounter is with law enforcement. And we have seen time and time again, unfortunately, that ends in violence. That has ended in violence. And what we want to see is direct access to psychiatric mental health care and resources. But what I find in speaking to parents and family members is that when mom or dad takes the person or the family member to the hospital, they're turned away because they're not a danger to themselves or others, or the hospital will say they're an adult, they can make decisions for themselves. So things have to get significantly worse. Oftentimes, families are ill-advised by law enforcement that the only way to get the person treatment is to charge them. And then you'll have a person that ends up criminalized because of their mental disorder. And so access to healthcare, access to mental health treatment and resources is a huge benefit to see an individual deterred from the criminal justice system and actually getting the mental health services like medication, treatment, and actually a psychiatrist. And it's really sad when a person is getting their first assessment while they're incarcerated in an overcrowded jail. The other part of that is employment. When you look at youth employment, and our youth are suffering, and we've seen it. The numbers are extremely high. The lack of employment opportunities is significant. And what you want to see are individuals getting access to their first job. So their summers are not connected to not doing anything productive, but their summers are connected to earning a wage. Oftentimes we're dealing with newcomers who have children that want to work, but they can't work because there's no opportunities. And so they end up finding themselves involved in things there to get money to help mom or dad out with the bills in the house. And then they find themselves incarcerated. So employment is a huge factor. Mental health is a huge factor, and so is education. And if we see young people walking away from school because it's too expensive, what are the alternatives? So we have a bigger issue here that we have to deal with, certainly in our community and our society overall. I don't know if we have enough time to talk about it. Thank you.
Yeah. And if I can just add very quickly, the education part is so important because we often hear about school to pipeline, the prison to pipeline that happens in our education system in terms of our kids. And in the US, they'll often say that their prisons are built based on the population of Black students in grade 3. And that by the time a child is in grade 3, it sometimes is determined early what path they're going down. And we see the challenges in our school system nationally for our Black children. And we know that our Black children are still not expected to succeed and go through high school, let alone go on to post-secondary. So we know that we are still seeing this school to prison pipeline in our school system. We know that our children are still being put on what's called an IPP, an individual program plan, very early, which limits your opportunity to go on to post-secondary education, which limits your opportunity for employment. So we need to look at the anti-Black racism that continues to exist in our education system as early as soon as we start. I did research, and this is what it's on today, as early as daycare, but even more so as soon as you start public education, you're already othered as a Black student.
Thank you. Thank you both. That was great. And I think it segues nicely into the next question, which is directed to you, Patricia. There's been much talk about bail reform in the criminal courts. What exactly does that mean?
I want to thank you for asking that question, because I think a lot of us are hearing about Bill C-14. Okay, this is a federal legislation, and it's a bail reform and sentencing act. And it was actually given royal assent on June 16th, 2026. And that is how quickly the law is going to change and has changed. And what a lot of us need to understand is the bail reform and the Bail and Sentencing Reform Act of Bill 14 is the centerpiece of this robust new crime bill that our federal government is imposing, and that will be a part of the criminal code as early as next month, July 15th, 2026. And basically what it says is, and this is really condensed version of it, is that 80 charges that are currently within the criminal code are going to be mended. There's going to be significant amendments to the Youth Criminal Justice Act and the National Defense Act. And most of the provisions are going to, like I said, take effect on July 15th, 2026. And so what it means as it relates to bail is the law expands categories for which offenses that are reverse onus applies. And so what does reverse onus mean? Typically, when you are arrested and you're going for bail in our province or in our country, you have a right to bail. This is a constitutional right, right? There's a fundamental right to reasonable bail. And when an individual applies for bail, there are particular onuses. And what does onus mean? It means, well, either the Crown has to demonstrate to the court that you should remain in custody up until your trial date or your sentencing date, or the reverse onus, meaning that you have to demonstrate to the court, the justice of the peace or judge, that you should be released from custody and your bail plan or the proposed surety will be sufficient to balance the risk of harm to the community and public safety. And so with this new bail reform, a lot of the criminal code offenses that originally would require the Crown to say you would have to stay in jail and prove or be a Crown onus bail is now going to be reverse onus, where the accused has to justify that they should no longer be detained. That's a significant issue. And I'm going to explain why that's significant in a few seconds. It also means it's really directed, as this is what the federal government says. It's directed to target repeat offenders with a relevant conviction in the previous 10 years and directs courts to weigh whether the alleged violence was random or unprovoked and restricts who can act as a surety. Here's the problem with that. More times than less, the people that are coming before the criminal courts are Black men, period. In addition to that, they're overcharged by police. And I can say that from my personal experience being a criminal defense lawyer, because I will look at the offenses as charged, and I'm like, you've charged him with a breach, but the breach was keeping the peace and being of good behavior. And you can't even pinpoint what factually that person has done to justify that charge. And I'm not even just talking about that. Sometimes they're charged with multiple offenses that once we get to the trial level, the Crown is withdrawing a third of the charges because they will never get a conviction. And so what that means systemically is that particular individual will most likely be facing a detention or a reverse onus situation. And oftentimes these individuals have no family or family members that are able to come forward, or their family members were also criminalized because unfortunately, there's an overrepresentation of Black offenders and First Nations peoples in our court system. When their family members come forward, they may also have a criminal record. So the surety suitability issue may become problematic. There's a lot there that the court that we're all going to have to consider. And so some of you may never have to go and grace yourself and be in front of a criminal court. Thank God. But if you do, or you have a family member or friend or someone you're connected to that's facing criminal charges, and they may very well be a first-time criminal offender who's presumed innocent under law, the challenges for them to get bail may be significant with this new robust crime bill. This crime bill will affect sentencing as well. I know that my colleague on the panel today is going to talk about sentencing, so I'll revisit that at a later part. But I think that when you look at bail reform and justice reform, I know that individuals are saying, well, if they're a repeat offender, they shouldn't get bail. Well, let's hold on though. If a person was caught stealing, something from a store, and they served that sentence or paid the fine or completed probation 10 years ago, and now they're charged with another theft offense or something that's a property related offense that has nothing to do with violence, why should they be denied bail? Why should we continue their detention? So I think that what we have to consider here is the case by case basis of these particular individuals that are being charged and the personal circumstances and personal antecedents. When a government entity or politics comes into play, and probably ties the hands of jurists, it puts us in a difficult situation, certainly when it comes to charter, rights to reasonable bail, and the presumption of innocence. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Patricia. That was very insightful. And something that I'm learning is the constitutional right to bail, because that information is not widely known in our communities, that there is that right. And of course, also along with that is the responsibilities that lie around that. But I'm wondering then, are there any steps that community members, I mean, I understand that Bill 14 will be coming to law on July 15th, but what can community members do at this point? How do they get their voices heard and even help shape decisions? Because we know that even when legislation has been passed, that we can affect it. So what do we as a community, what are some of the possibilities for us to get our voices on the table?
So I want to clarify something. When a young person, a youth under the Youth Criminal Justice Act is arrested, it is never a reverse onus. There is a presumption against custody for young people. I'm just speaking on them being overcharged at times and certainly being met with a show cause hearing. But yes, it's never a reverse onus on children. As it relates to your question as how we as a community can address this, certainly when you are dealing with, as members of the community, when you're going to vote, and certainly when you're dealing with your members of parliament, you can talk to them and talk to them about how this is adversely impacting your life and your family members in your community. I think that's one step. The other thing that we as lawyers are going to have to do is what we call constitutional challenges. If we feel as though the new legislation is really creating an onus that is profoundly unfair, being a member of the Criminal Lawyers Association in Ontario myself, one of the things we most likely will do is draft charter applications and constitutionally challenge the legislations. But we certainly encourage each one of you guys, if you are significantly concerned, review that bill and just kind of get your mind around it. and talk to your members of parliament, and write letters to let them know how you feel, because I think oftentimes we're not speaking out as we should. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Barb, did you want to add?
Well, one thing that I would add is I worry about how long some of our people of African descent are on remand when they're incarcerated. And also the challenges around sureties when they are looking for bail. Like that already is challenging for some because of often what they have to prove in order to have a surety. And even some of the restrictions that our Black folks, community members face. And it breaks my heart when you see folks who are wanting to connect to things that are good for them, such as going to church or finding being in faith. And their surety may not be connected to faith, but they now are, and that they can't go to this place unless they have their surety to go with them. And so there's a lot of challenges, even in terms of when people are coming back into our community. And I think that C14 is going to make a lot of things more difficult. And you'll have some individuals that will say, I'd rather stay on remand because there's nothing for me to go to, because the support and the resources aren't there. And so you have a number of our family members, and I say family members in terms of our large Black community family members, who are serving out their sentence on remand, which is scary when they could be released. Yeah.
Okay.
I actually agree with that a lot. I find that oftentimes our clients, my clients are met with, if they're denied bail, then we have to do a 90-day detention review. Sureties are found to be improper or not suitable. Significant cross-examination of sureties. Even though, Ontario is moving to a more streamlined bail process, sometimes they're still met with a lot of difficulty and challenges. And I agree with you 100% that they're spending far too much time in remand. But there's studies that show that the likelihood of a Black person getting bail on their first try is it's difficult, and it shouldn't be that way. And a lot of it occurs because of a lot of anti-Black racism, overcharging, and the way in which their cases are scrutinized. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Before we move on to round two, I just want to read a few of the comments. Somebody thanked you, Patricia, for the clarification that you made earlier. And there's another question here. How much education our children get about the impact of the justice system? And maybe, Barb, I know you've done some research with earlier years, school years. I'm wondering if you might want to comment on that.
Well, I'm just sitting here and getting some brainwaves with that question. And the same way we do a lot around health education. And I remember some of our different provinces not being comfortable about how some of our schools were teaching sex education early, which is important. It needs to be taught early. I mean, when you have children who are 12 and being a health educator, being pregnant or having sex, you need to have sex education in grade 6 and grade 5. No matter what parents are comfortable with, it needs to start early. Similarly, we need to have the conversation with the justice system. And we can break that down early. What does it mean to be involved in the justice system? Because we often will talk about, I want to be a lawyer. So if we want to be a lawyer or a judge, do we talk about how you can be impacted by the justice system? And that's every child. And then being focused on what happens to people who are racialized, who are Black, and having these conversations early in our school system. And what ways can you do to not be involved in the justice system? And if you are involved in the justice system, what are your rights? Like we used to have a number of young lawyers who would go around and do presentations with our young people about what police can and can't ask you. And so that our youth knew their rights, because all of us who are Black parents have to have those conversations with our children. And so we had a number of young lawyers who were helping us, saying we're going to have these conversations early because our children need to know their rights, because too often their rights are taken advantage of. And so there's no reason why we can't have this in our school system. And I would encourage any educators who are on this call right now to think about how can we write curriculum that talks about the justice system, and that we learn not just about the laws that the government puts in place, but about our rights and what happens and what is an carceral system? What does that look like? And we knew about, kids growing up that were sent to the boys' school, but we didn't know what the boys' school was. We didn't know that was jail, right? Or girls that would go to the girls' school. And sometimes this is how our kids who would have been my peers would have been going to a youth jail. And you didn't know why or what. So I think we need to do a better job of talking about the justice system, both the positives and some of the challenges and things we need to be aware of, and build it into our curriculum earlier, the same way we do with sex education and health education.
Thank you. Patricia, did you want to add anything to that?
I agree with everything Dr. Hamilton Hinch is saying. I think that educating not just the children, but parents, you would be shocked because a lot of us, we watch American TV, right? And so we just assume that the way it works on television is how it works in Canada, and that's not it. And I think that even talking about the Constitution, your charter rights, your right to remain silent, your right to an attorney, your right to a lawyer, these are fundamental principles of law. And so when someone gets arrested and I'm telling them, you have a right to remain silent, do not discuss anything with the police. And then when I'm speaking to a youthful offender, listen, I don't care if they offer you a hamburger. I don't care if they want to give you a Snickers bar. You don't say nothing. Keep your mouth shut. Because when you say something, it can and will be used against you in a court of law. I also tell youth, and if their parents are on the phone with them at the station, telling the parents not to sign waivers, do not waive your right to remain silent. Exercise your right to remain silent. The charges are serious. Sometimes people think, well, it's a theft offense. Well, here's the issue. If you get convicted of a theft offense, that is a crime of moral turpitude. A conviction of that nature could bar you from admission into the United States of America. It could deny you particular employment opportunities, etc. I could go on. And so no offense is minor. Every charge is serious. It could adversely impact your career. If you want to work with healthcare in Ontario, it will definitely interfere with you vulnerable persons check. So you can't have access to particular types of employment. If you're pursuing higher education, that particular offense could cause you lack of access to that school or that employment opportunity. So you want to make sure you get some type of information from a lawyer. And I feel like oftentimes people don't know where to go when you're charged. You got to do your research. You got to talk to get a consultation. In the province of Ontario, we have the Law Society of Ontario. And when you have that, you could go through the lawyer's referral service and get a consultation, a free 30-minute consultation with a criminal defense lawyer. There's Legal Aid Ontario. So every courthouse in the province has a duty counsel, criminal duty counsel on staff. You can go and talk to them about what's going on and see what guidance you can get. But I think that knowing is half the battle. And unfortunately, by the time you are speaking to a lawyer, you might feel like it's too late, but you can try to seek out some information. And maybe this is the great forum for us to have an educational seminar on how do we inform families and children and young people about their rights. I also feel that this is an issue as it relates to immigration law as well. There are secondary consequences for arrest and detention if you are a student on a visa visiting our country and you get charged and you're like, okay, well, I have a deal on the table. Should I take a peace bond? That might adversely impact your ability to renew your student visa. So you need to be able to know what your rights are whenever you're facing any type of criminal charges. And it's good to do that sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much. I see the need for further discussion on this particular topic, and I'm sure Donna has it documented for next year, for the next series coming up. I'm going to move on to our second set of questions, if that's okay with everybody. And this question is directed to Barb. I understand that you help write impact of race and cultural assessments reports, IRCAS, in
Yes.
Nova Scotia for people of African descent that are coming up for sentencing. Can you tell us a little bit about them and why they are important?
Sure, and similar to what Patricia, I know our time is tight, but I'll give a quick summary of IRCAs. And so, one thing I do want to acknowledge is Professor Robert Wright, who's a sociologist and a social worker, who is one of the individuals who's been credited with the founding of IRCAs in Nova Scotia. And he wrote the first IRCA in 2012. And it's important to recognize that impact, race, and cultural assessments are built on the foundation of what's known as GLADU reports. And GLADU reports are pre-sentence reports that have been written for people who are Indigenous. So similarly, impact of race and cultural assessments can be considered a tool such as a pre-sentence report, but it goes more into depth. Within the impact of race and cultural assessments, we take in consideration historical and generational trauma. We take in consideration education, environment, family background. We take in consideration mental health, all from an Afrocentric lens. What was going on in that person's life from the time they were born to the time they got involved in the criminal justice system. And that's important to take into consideration when we talk about the number of systems that we as people of African descent don't trust. What was the education system like? Did they experience suspension? Were they on an IPP? What was their healthcare system like? Were they seeing regular appointments? Do they have a psychoeducational assessment? Were they getting counseling? What kind of trauma did they experience? Did they witness trauma? Did they see violence in their household? Did they themselves, were they a victim of violence? Were they beaten? What was their, and we often call adverse childhood experiences? We'll look at that. So we look at the whole person from an Afrocentric lens to try to understand them and to bring that to the courts for them to not just look at this person before them and what they're being charged with, but to understand their history, to understand who they are, to understand how some of these things might have contributed to their involvement in the criminal justice system. And that is so, so important when you think about the anti-Black racism that exists here in Canada. And so we have been in Nova Scotia, every person who identifies as a person of African descent or Black by law is supposed to be offered an IRCA. And so IRCAs have expanded across the country. I have been working with Natalie Hodgson, and we have written some of the first IRCAs in the country, both in Quebec and New Brunswick and Newfoundland, and even in the Yukon. And now through the Department of Justice, you're seeing a number of different organizations getting funding to also be able to train and increase the number of IRCA assessors across the country. We're not where we want to be. We recognize there is a need for more, and we're here to try to increase that number. And when I talk about GLADUs, and I'll really quickly talk about the Criminal Code of Canada, 718.2E talks about all available sanctions other than imprisonment that are reasonable in their circumstances and consistency with the harm done to victims or to the community should be considered for all offenders, with a particular attention to the circumstances, in this case, of Indigenous offenders. So we use that criminal code to talk about the need to make sure we're centering the lived experience of people of African descent in any sentencing decision. It's important to point out that IRCAs are not a get out of jail free card or to reduce the sentence. It's to get the courts to take in consideration when sentencing why things might have happened in this young person's life or in this person's life. Because we know, as was already shared, that many people of African descent often receive a harsher sentence for the exact same crime than other people who are non-Black. And so that's what IRCAs really do. We really say to the courts, you need to look at this. You need to take into consideration the biases and the challenges that are happening in our system and really come up with a reasonable sentence for this person who is standing before you in the courts. So that's the primary things that IRCA does.
Thank you so much. And so, Patricia, I know you have some ideas you want to share about IRCA. I invite you to do so now.
So again, I agree with everything that my colleague on the panel has said today about that. And I'm going to speak from a frontline perspective. In the province of Ontario, specifically in the Southwest region, we have been waiting, and we have cases where we're waiting 12 to 18 months to access an assessor. And if you don't believe me, I have published cases on this particular situation where a Black accused person could not access a report and was waitlisted in our jurisdiction anyway. And so this is often the case down in this region. And so what I would like to see is that we create a list of IRCA writers, and that list is disseminated to lawyers, criminal defense lawyers, and criminal law associations. And I think that there has to be education on this, because I think our jurist and our Crown law need to know that certainly we have the decision of R.V. Morris, where we know what this Court of Appeals has said, but we also understand that there needs to be more education about what IRCA means and what it is, and how an enhanced pre-sentence report for a Black offender will help a judge as it relates to sentencing have a better empathetic understanding at that individual accused person. And so what I'm hoping from this conversation, and I'm going to work with my colleague because I want to see change. I do want us to have that list created as soon as possible. And we can work with that particular, we can work together to disseminate the list of assessors so that these individuals who are incarcerated have that access to justice. That should not be a barrier for Black accused.
I want to just also take the moment to acknowledge the Viola Desmond Justice Institute out of Montreal. And for those of you who don't know about Quebec and Montreal, the anti-Black racism that exists in that province. And the Viola Desmond Justice Institute is really pushing to increase the number of assessors. And one thing that's really important when we talk about assessors is making sure that they are credentialized. So we have a program at Dalhousie University that was, again, created and developed by Natalie Hodgson and Robert Wright to give IRCA's assessors a credentialization. And so what we want to make sure is that not only are we producing and having a number of IRCA's assessors, but we want to make sure that they have the right credentials. And so what we mean by that is every IRCA assessor that comes out of the Viola Desmond Justice Institute, and I can speak to the African Nova Scotia Justice Institute, have to have a minimum of a master's education in counseling. The reason why that is important, and it could be a master's of social work or other health professions like that, is because of the amount of research that needs to go into producing a really effective IRCA. And so we want to make sure that they have that master's train. We want to make sure that they've gone through the training of a micro-credential and have the certification. So when we develop this, when Viola Desmond is looking at how can we develop a list of people, African Nova Scotian Justice Institute, similarly, they have a list of counselors. We want to make sure that the list that is that people are tapping into are a list of folks who have met the credentials to be an IRCA assessor, because you're seeing different assessors popping up that may have a bachelor's in social work. And I'm not dismissing that. I don't want to, I'm not disvaluing their important work and the work that organization may be doing. But I do really want to stress the importance of the research that goes into the IRCAs and the attention that goes into detail. So I hear you, Patricia Brown, and we are going to make sure, I know the Viola Desmond Justice Institute is really committed to making sure that there's a more wealth of information available across the country, not just in Montreal, and that we have a number of IRCA assessors. And I know that there's different assessments and training popping up with the Sankofa project. TMU is getting involved. I know we're trying to look at how we can support it in McGill. And in Nova Scotia, we do a great job in our law school of making sure every law school student gets a course on critical race theory. And Dr. Marie Degas does a lot of writing on IRCAs. She's a well-known lawyer and professor at Dow, so she writes about IRCAs and also teaches about IRCA in her curriculum. So it'd be great to have this across our country in our law schools and in our schools of social work and other counseling programs where you're learning about IRCAs, because we still have a number of judges and lawyers who don't understand what IRCAs are. And so we also need to find ways to do professional development for our judges and lawyers currently, because I've been an expert witness where I've been questioned about the futility of IRCAs and having to first justify why we even write them and why we have them in our court system. And we shouldn't have to do that in this day and age.
Thank you. I want to make two quick comments. One is there is certainly a need for education around IRCAs in law school. So any lawyers who are online or who are teaching um, in law schools, it's an area that has not received much attention. So, I've taught first and upper year law students. 99% of them have never heard of IRCA. So that's something that I'm so happy that there are a number of um, schools and private entities that will be looking into it. Bob, I have a follow-up question, and you touched on it, but I like tools that I can walk away with, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what are three principles or three bits of information that an effective IRCA would have.
I would definitely talk about the historical and generational trauma. And we know that Dr. Drew DeGrue talks about post traumatic slave syndrome. And the system seems to want to forget that we haven't experienced this generational trauma and how that impacts who we are. And I think it's important to identify the other systems that have disenfranchised us. The education system is one of them. We have very many challenges in our school system. We often have an overrepresentation of our number of young people that are diagnosed as ADHD, or we have a number of folks that are underdiagnosed with some of their mental health challenges. And it's seen as being behavior, and the supports that they need are not put in place. Another one that I would say that's really important to recognize is our mental health and our mental health that's impacted both from family, by our individual, and by the witnessing trauma. We all have been impacted in different ways. When we saw the death of George Floyd, we can't deny that and how that impacted us as Black people. And what has that done to our bodies viscerally when we see the police or when we're being pulled over? So the trauma isn't just trauma that's being done to you individually, the trauma is being done to our community, the trauma that you might have witnessed coming from a war-torn country. And we need to recognize our immigrant community and what they're escaping in some places and how that impacts them settling into a new country. And that could be their language, the culture. And all of that needs to be rolled up into this thing called trauma that no one wants to talk about. And we need to recognize how trauma can impact our involvement in the justice system. So those would be three really key things that I'd say are important to acknowledge. And I mean, the list goes on, but those are three that jump out at me.
I thank you. Thank you so much. And that information provides a helpful foundation for our final question to Patricia. What does justice reform look like within our criminal justice system?
I think that justice reform looks like a robust reinvention of how we treat Black people in the system. First of all, I feel that Black people are criminalized because of their skin. Oftentimes they're disenfranchised because of how they look. And there is a preconceived notion that they are engaged in the criminality. And I see that in our jurisdictions, particularly with my migrant immigrant workers, and there's a presumption that they may have in fact done something and they are treated differently. They're overcharged, as I stated earlier, and they are oftentimes denied bail, or they're pre-conviction detention or pre-charge defense, pre-sentence detention is significantly longer than other people, and they're sentenced harsher. And this is not just something I've observed. There's statistics, and I see Dr. Barbara Hamilton nodding her head. This has been something that is identified. And I feel that we as a community want to move forward and participate more in our electoral process. We need to be more vocalized and mobilized and talk about how these particular changes are impacting our children and our communities, and even our immigrant family members that are coming over here who are being stigmatized. I think that we should not ignore that there is anti-Black racism in law enforcement. We have to get over this foolishness with their one bad apple, here's one bad apple. And we need to revisit the fact that there are members of law enforcement that engage in policing with this idea of racial profiling. It is existing and it has to be stomped out. And I think that when we as professionals are interacting with our counterparts, we need to have these conversations. There was some conversation earlier about how can we deal and address with wellness as dealing with family members. We need to revisit this as a community. Oftentimes, we engage in stigmatization of community members who are charged, who are facing offenses, and we don't embrace them and support them to help them reacclimate in society. We need to be more supportive of people who are accused of offenses, and support them in their education, job, employment. We need to revisit these things because I think if we support them, they may not find themselves back in the criminal justice system. One of the things I also have noted in the First Nations, with my First Nations families and cases that I assist with, is we do sentencing circles. Why not introduce that in the Black community? By bringing, if there was an offense committed against a family member, bringing them all together in the same room so that we could talk about the trauma in the family to help heal and break the cycle of generational issues where you see fathers and mothers who are dealing with trauma finding themselves before the court system, aunts and uncles, and having the cycle break. And so that we can break it. And sometimes it happens in a courtroom. Sentencing circles is something that we could particularly consider with our community as well. So there's a lot of work to be done, but it's going to take the effort of community. It's going to take all of us working together. And we need to be vocal when we speak to members of parliament. Some of us are friends with members of parliament. Get their ear, have coffee with them, and talk to them about how you as a Black person feel when you're dealing with law enforcement and with members of the judiciary who don't know anything about an IRCA. I don't think a judge should be appointed if they don't know what an IRCA assessment is. Those are my thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I'm just going to check the chat to see what some of the comments. I'll read one. The government recently announced an advisory council on rights, equality, inclusion, and the council's initial mandate did not explicitly mention anti-Black racism, and its announced membership did not include any Black representative. We talk and talk and talk, and this still happens. Certainly, anti-Black racism is alive and flourishing in this political arena at this time, socially and politically. I know that I just need to take a moment to recognize one of our great elders in the chat, which is Miss Tora Espinette, who has done some amazing work in courts and for the Black communities in Ontario. Was my board of sat on as was one of my board members at Humber College, and I know she did a whole lot of amazing work there. So it's Father's Day, and so I know people want to get off and get on with celebrations. I wonder if there are any last final words from the two panelists before we wrap up.
I'm just excited with the interest in this topic and the importance of it for our community. And I love what I'm reading in the chat, how many people are interested in learning more and knowing more. And I think that's an indication that we're tired, that we are really beginning to embrace more and more Ubuntu. And I think that we need to have our actions be reflected in that. And I love how my panelists also talked about the need for us as a community to help reduce the stigma, because some of the charges that our community members are facing are sometimes so minimal, and yet their lives can be changed so quickly by one charge. And we really need to think about, but by grace am I. And that could be one of our children, it could be one of us. And how would we want people to receive us? And I think that that's really important. And we need to pay attention to Bill C-14. And we need to find ways to make sure that our young people, because they're all of our children, are being educated more and more about their rights. And even when the comment was, I feel safer in jail, I saw that written down than being with my grandmother. We need to explore that. We need to find out what are alternatives. What is that child going through, and where is the community in that case? And I think about, our grandparents. Our grandparents raised our children when our parents couldn't. And we need to think about how can we continue to support our community. I really appreciate this talk today. And I also like to take the time to wish anyone on the call who is celebrating Father's Day and those who stepped in the place for fathers. We see you. We appreciate you.
My final words, I echo again my colleague, and it has been an honor to sit on a panel with Dr. Barbara Hamilton Hinch. It is an honor. I admire you from afar, and it's been a pleasure hearing from you today and being with you in this capacity. I don't want to be remiss. I don't want you to leave this particular meeting today in a negative way. We also have to recognize that there has been changes in our criminal code and criminal justice system. Specifically, section 493.2 has been enumerated and codified in law in our country. And that specifically deals with Aboriginal accused persons or vulnerable populations. And that section of the criminal code directs jurists to consider the overrepresentation of First Nations and Black offenders and racialized people in our country. And so I want us to keep doing the work. I don't want you to give up. I don't want you to feel invisible. I want you to feel empowered by this conversation and know there's much work to be done, but we have been effective in the work that we continue to do. We will continue. And I know that in my little corner of the world, where I'm working, I want you to know that I will do the very best that I can for my clients and to advocate for their rights constitutionally. There was also something that was mentioned about legal aid, and is legal aid effective? I want you to know that each and every lawyer, especially lawyers in Ontario, we all swear an oath to protect the rights of our clients and work for them tirelessly. I consider myself a ferocious advocate in the courtroom. And so whether you are representing someone and you are representing them on a private retainer or legal aid, don't take the case, don't touch the case if you're not going to fight to death to the end. I went to the Supreme Court of Canada on legal aid. So that doesn't frighten me. It's working and fighting and advocating for people. And far too often, individuals feel like I need to mortgage my house to pay for a lawyer. Go and sit down and meet with the lawyer and talk with them. Because if they treat you different, if you're a legal aid client compared to a cash private retainer, then that's not the lawyer for you. There are a lot of good, passionate young lawyers out there that are willing to do the work and have the same level of advocacy than somebody that's going to charge you a $100,000 retainer. So we need to get rid of the stigma as a community and use our good common sense when we're dealing with family members and friends, because lawyers have licenses to protect. And so they should be doing a good job and be effective counsel. So I hope that gives you some inspiration. I want to thank everybody for being here, and it's been an honor to participate on this panel today. Thank you so very much.
Okay, thank you all. As our panelists have demonstrated, the issues surrounding criminal justice are multifaceted and deeply layered. I'm leaving with two things today. One, community voices must be at the center of reform. And second, and thank you, Patricia, there is hope. And there is hope in our capacity to take action. Thanks again to our panelists for sharing their expertise, passion, and living experiences. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Hope you got something from this conversation. I sure did. I wish you well from my heart to yours, Ubuntu. Have a great day. Bye-bye.